Once again, thank you for having me down, even though it's virtual, for your virtual workshop here this morning. I caught a little bit of Laura's last 10 minutes or so, and I think there's about 3 or 4 topics that she touched on that we'll probably go a little bit more in depth on here this morning too. So feel free to ask questions as we go along, and I'll stick on a little bit afterwards too if there are any other questions or concerns. So we're going to talk a little bit about some fertility and nutrient management update today. Can't really talk about soil fertility without talking about fertilizer prices and where they're at and where we've been. So I've talked a lot about this all, I guess, late fall and winter. So I threw up on the screen there about 3 years or so of price points of urea map on and potash to see where we've been and where we've come from, going back to about January 2020. So that's when we last saw, you know, the more conventional price points as far as NP and K go. And so you can see, you know, you can go into about December of 21. I throw those on the screen simply because there were a lot of concerns that the price hikes were simply due to world events over in Eastern Europe, and that's not necessarily the case. So you look at a lot of the price volatility that we've seen here over the last 2 to 3 years. A lot of that started before those world events. You look at 2020 was the big COVID year. So a lot of fertilizer manufacturing, supply, mining, etc. A lot of those plants have to get shut down 2 to 4 times a year for maintenance. And a lot of that was delayed until 21. And so a lot of those operations had shutdowns at the same time. So that created a little bit of a price crunch. Also, don't forget, I believe in the fall of 21, August, September, we had Hurricane Ida come up through the port of New Orleans. A lot of fertilizer gets shipped up the Mississippi. So that created a little bit of a price crunch. And so that's when we really started to see that price spike. Then that carried through to 2022. And so you can see last year at this time, we were looking at end prices that were 3 times what we were normally used to seeing, and then P and K about 2.5 to 3 times what we were normally used to seeing. So I pulled some prices from about 2 weeks ago. You can look at N has come down. Now, a lot of us think it has come down substantially. It's still 2 times what it was 2-3 years ago. Phos and potash haven't come down nearly as much, a little bit logistical issue and where those products tend to come from. They have come down slightly. I think I looked price updates as of yesterday, and each of those came down a couple pennies from those prices listed there. So we're headed in a better direction than where we were. However, we're still substantially greater than where we were 3 years ago. So it's still a great time to think about what we do with that fertilizer and with that strategy and with those nutrients. Also down towards the bottom there, I put anhydrous ammonia in 28, what those price points were as of late. So I'm getting a lot of questions in with producers about maybe changing end sources. Typically, anhydrous has been substantially cheaper per pound of N. I see some producers considering switching over to urea. So it is a good time to consider switching to other sources. The only piece of advice I would give is make sure you still apply those sources appropriately. There's different infrastructure, different logistics with each of these end sources. So that would still be something to consider moving forward. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about soybeans here this morning, then switch over a little bit to corn. We've done a lot of work with soybeans over the last 6, 8, 10 years, looking at multiple different aspects. We've looked at sulfur, we've looked at nitrogen, we've looked a lot with starters. So I'm going to share a little bit of that. You know, in a nutshell, we know soybean yields have gone up. You know, some of this is environmental driven, some of this is genetics, and some of this is management. We know one of the biggest changes that we've seen probably over the last 20 to 30 years is greater dry matter production. You know, and I always joke with producers when I'm giving a talk in person, you know, I'm 6'2" or 6'3", and it's not uncommon to get soybeans that, you know, are up to my armpits nowadays. And so it's a little bit different. And we know the greater dry matter production, the more nutrient accumulation we have. That's what really drives that nutrient uptake. And so we've done a lot of work looking at where some of these nutrients go with mid-season applications, preseason, in late season applications. We'll talk a little bit about that. We know there's yield gaps that have been discovered. And then the question always comes up is, do we need to fertilize soybeans? Because you can talk to a lot of soil fertility specialists. And when you hear a big thumping coming from my desk here in Michigan, just north of all of you, it's probably looking at those yields when the combine goes through and we don't see a significant response. And so we'll talk about some of those issues and why. So you look at a soybean plant like this. This is some of the intensive management work we've done over the years. Great looking stand of soybeans, potted out, a lot of nodes, etc. And so I think, yes, obviously we do still need to fertilize soybeans. But one of the big differences that I always warn producers on is that soybeans are not corn, right? When we start looking at nutrient management, a lot of us fall into that habit of basing fertilizer applications on corn, and soybeans are quite different with regards to how they behave to nutrient management. And here's a great example. I said we've done a lot of starter fertilizer work, a lot of 2x2 application work on soybeans over the years. And you can see, those green areas in the field, those green rectangle squares, etc. Who wouldn't want that with soybeans, right? We see that on corn. Oftentimes that carries through till harvest time with regards to yield. But soybeans are different. They respond much differently as that season progresses. And one of the big differences is when you start looking at corn, we see that rapid uptake of nutrients just prior to R1. We see that greatest demand of something like nitrogen in those 30 days surrounding silking. And once that grain fill period begins around R2, grain yield becomes a little less sensitive to nitrogen and water stress as that crop matures. Now you look at the bottom, soybeans are a little bit different. That nutrient uptake pattern is a little bit more similar to how biomass is put on. So it's a little bit more season long. So that tends to be a little bit more protracted out throughout that entire growing season, which can be good and bad. If conditions are good, the longer we spend at each growth stage, the more likely we're able to uptake more nutrients. We can have a longer stay green potential, etc. But if water becomes limiting, or phosphorus or sulfur or potassium, this can create an issue the longer you spend at each growth stage. And so we're going to look at a couple patterns and strategies here to enhance uptake. And we always get the question about applying nitrogen to soybeans. And I always like to address it a little bit with how soybean N uptake differs from corn. So if you look at by about R1, so here in southern Michigan, typically R1, we're looking at about that 3rd or 4th week in June. You only get about 20% of your N uptake by that point of the growing season. And then you step forward by the time you hit seed fill, for us, again, probably about late July, 1st week in August, you still have only uptaken about half of your nitrogen. So that last half comes after that R4 growth stage. And a lot of that after about that R5 growth stage will come from the soil, not remobilization from within the plant. And so do soybeans need nitrogen? Absolutely. Can they produce their own? Absolutely. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But just to give you a little bit perspective, you can see by that top number up here, you're looking at close to 5 pounds of total N per bushel. So even if you look at 60 bushel beans, you're looking at about 300 units of N, of which about 3.5 pounds of that goes to the grain. So yes, they need nitrogen, but they are fortunate to produce a lot of that themselves. Some grower implications with N on soybeans. Most of that N uptake, remember, is after R1. So you really got to caution yourself with singular early applied soluble N applications. We know with greater yields than soybeans, a lot of that, we tend to get a little bit more uptake and oftentimes a longer duration of N uptake. And, I always tell producers, focus on that season long N availability. Focus on maximizing fixation. Remember, anything that influences plant growth will influence N fixation. Focus on N mineralization. And are there yield gaps or gaps early in the season? That's something I want to talk more on here in a second. The other nutrient that we often focus on with soybeans is potassium, right? And potassium uptake in soybean differs substantially from nitrogen, and how by the time we get to R1, again, similarly to N, we've only uptaken about 25% of the K in that plant. But by the time we get to that R4 growth stage, about 70% of that K uptake has occurred before seed fill. So that's where the change really kicks in between something like potassium and nitrogen. And so you can look at how much K gets taken up by a soybean plant. 60 bushel beans would remove about 70 pounds of K2O versus 200 bushel corn, only about 40 pounds of K2O would be removed. So soybeans do uptake quite a bit of potassium. It tends to peak in those late vegetative stages before R1. And once we get to late season, we tend to see a lot less potassium uptake. And so this is why we always talk about trying to ensure those pre-plant soil test potassium levels, because by the time we get to mid-season, it's probably too late. Okay, we can't put enough K into the plant with a foliar application, and we can't correct a deficiency, a large deficiency mid-season. So make sure you know those critical soil test levels and beware of some of those potential application timing issues. Want to throw this on the screen. So obviously, yes, we updated the tri-state nutrient recs about 2.5 years ago now. Familiarize yourself with those critical levels. You can see phos and listed in this top chart, and then we have broken down to CC less than 5 and greater than 5, with those critical levels for potassium being 100 or 120 part per million respectively. Then you can look at nutrient removal values in that bottom blue table there. Those come from thousands of different grain samples. So I've been getting a lot of questions on how accurate those are. Those came from all 3 states, Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana, and thousands of samples went into those averages. Now, obviously, you're going to have different yielding areas within a field. And so some of those high yielding pockets in that field might remove a little bit more, and some of those lower yielding pockets are probably going to remove a little bit less. But nonetheless, it is a good rule of thumb to go with some of those averages you see listed right there. Now, what we've spent a lot of time on here over the last probably 4 or 5 years is looking at when does N fixation begin in the soybean plant. And I'll pause a second and have all of you think about it, because I always ask my students, I teach in the fall, when does N fixation begin in the soybean plant? And the responses I get are all over the board, or staring at your boots or staring at the ceiling tiles, because you don't know what the heck the answer is. And so when you look at literature, you'll find anywhere between emergence and V6, right? That's a pretty broad time frame. And so we want to take a little better look at when that N fixation process does begin, because that may impact a little bit of these questions we get on N application timing in soybeans. And so this last couple of years, we've looked at starter applications. We do a lot of starter fertilizer work because here in the Northern Corn Belt, we have a much more condensed growing season. So we tend to see a pretty good response from starter on our N responsive crops, predominantly corn and wheat. But what about soybeans? So we wanted to look at granular starters, we've looked at liquid starters, and then you can see towards the bottom there looking at pre-plant V4 and R2N applications on soybean. And you can see we want to do this across a couple different planting dates. So for us, early planting would be anything before May 1, and then anything between May 1 and June 1 would be considered normal planting. And you can see the 6 different fertility treatments we've looked at. Nothing. Looking at granular 2x2 with about 25 units of N, 60 phos, and 15 sulfur, liquid equivalent in a 2x2, and then 100 pounds of N, PPI, V4, and R2. All sorts of different data points we've collected over the years. We were also looking at NDFA or N15 work, looking at how much N in that soybean plant is derived from the atmosphere, and then also looking at a little bit of those ureide abundance values in the plant to determine how much N got into the plant. And so one thing we've seen, and I always get questions on this over the years, when we use starter on soybeans, man, we always get a plant response. And so look at this last growing season in 2022. You can look at the 2 planting dates up at the top, April 29th and May 20th. Fertilizer treatments listed along the left there, going down April 29th. You can see looking at canopy coverage, where we have that dry and liquid 2x2 starter, significant difference as compared to doing nothing and pre-plant incorporated N. As we got over into this later planting date, a little bit of response, but not much this last growing season. So again, is this just an early planted issue? That's one of the questions we wanted to address. Looking at R1, canopy coverage, again, that response tends to carry through. You can look at 25 to 27% canopy coverage versus everything else listed there. We see this significant response. Now, the problem we run into is you get those accelerated growth rates once you get about R1, R2 that carry forward. So a lot of times these responses that we see in the field will dissipate as you get into R2, 3, and 4. Not always, though. It depends on that specific growing season. And with that more regularly planted soybean timing, you can still see that starter response carried through as far as canopy coverage. Now, when do soybeans begin to fix nitrogen? Here's a picture of that April 29th planting date on the left. It was taken 25 days after planting. Look at all the nodules you see on that plant. So it can happen early in the season. Look at that May 20th planting date. 4 days later, obviously, you got that radical emerging from that seed. We don't see fixation beginning when you don't have an established root system. So it can occur early in the season. I would say when we look at even the last 2 growing seasons, we've had a moist spring and a very dry spring. The dry one we had was in 21. We did not see nodulation like this picture on the left for probably 4 to 5 or 6 weeks after planting, versus this last growing season, we saw it within 3 weeks. And so again, those are those time periods we really want to focus in on is, are we leaving yield in the field by not fixing it early in the season with that plant? Now, I always like to throw these pictures up there looking at these rooting habits. You can see that top left picture, that's your check plot. You know, that top center picture, can you tell where that 2x2 application was placed? Absolutely. Look at those roots migrate over to the right and they tapped right into that 2x2 application. With the liquid 2x2 on the top right, we see that a little bit, but not nearly as much this last growing season. Down towards the bottom is your PPI, V4, and R2N. Those rooting structures, look a little bit more abundant towards the top as compared to the check plot. So we're influencing that. That R2N looked a little bit more similar to that check plot, so not nearly as significant. I should say we do a lot of our studies in duplicate with under irrigation and non-irrigation. So I threw some of these numbers up there, but I'll focus mostly on the non-irrigated because that applies to most growers. Looking at nodule counts at R4, by the time we hit R4, nodulation is pretty much wrapped up and beginning to decline. Look at those fertility treatments across the bottom, 6 fertility treatments. There's a lot of A's on that screen, right? So that can be good and bad. One, we didn't impact nodulation at a lot of these rates, but that's assuming that nodulation is the key indicator of fixation. So we've done a lot of nodulation counts over the years. You can ask any of my graduate students. They're probably quite tired of doing this. So on a positive side, we haven't impacted nodulation per se from a quantity standpoint with some of these treatments. Look at couple pictures taken from this last growing season. Picture on the left, check plot versus those 2 starter treatments. So again, we're seeing this flush in early season biomass compared to our N applications over on the right, not nearly as much. And this is why we focus a lot more on starter, simply because we can see this response early in the season. With that later planting date, it was much, much more minimal. Did not see nearly as many differences as we typically do as compared to that early planting date. Now, you start looking at some of these biological and fixation factors. So I threw this up there, looking at R2 and R6 and NDFA, that stands for nitrogen derived from the atmosphere. So what we don't want to do is fertilize soybeans and simply cause that plant to fix less nitrogen naturally, right? That's not the direction soybean production needs to go. We want it to be more of a sustainable cropping system. So if you look at R2, I threw this red line right there, looking at no fertilizer and our starter treatments, no significant difference. So that's a positive. We're not negatively impacting the amount of N that was derived from the atmosphere. Start getting into our nitrogen treatments down towards the bottom there. We are, with that PPIN, impacting the amount of N fixed from the atmosphere. Big question comes, what about R6? As we get into R6, same thing with those starter treatments. We're not negatively impacting that plant as far as N derived from the atmosphere. And as we get into those nitrogen treatments, we tend to. That R2N was a little bit close in proximity to that R6, so that hasn't necessarily had that full effect yet. As we get into ureide analysis in the stem of that plant, same thing tends to show up. Those starter treatments behave much more similarly to no application. And then that's when we really see those blanket N applications kick in. That basically means we're offsetting some of the fixation potential of that plant. Grain yield based on planting date this last year. Obviously, I know Laura's done a lot of these planting date studies over the years. We tend to see a response to early planting. This year we did not, or I should say in 2022, we did not. It was so darn dry that really impacted us from an irrigated and a non-irrigated perspective. But from a fertilizer treatment perspective, you can see blue bar are under irrigation, green bar are not under irrigation. Look at those green bars, they're all A's. We saw no significant yield response once again. Look at from an irrigated perspective, this is something we've picked up on over the years. We actually have seen a fertility response under irrigation. This goes back probably 3 out of the last 4 years. The problem we run into when you look at those dry and liquid 2x2s is we probably get a little bit too much biomass. Now, I have never had a soybean come back with a test weight under 50, and this year we did. And it was these 2 treatments right here. And why did those test weights suffer? We just had too much biomass. So I should mention, we do all of our work in 30-inch rows. So can we get too much biomass in 30-inch rows? Absolutely. Can we promote white mold in 30-inch rows under irrigation? Absolutely, even with a fungicide application. And so these liquid and dry 2x2 treatments had so much biomass, it shaded out the bottom canopy, and those beans just could not finish off appropriately towards the end of the season. So some is good, more is better. It is something to keep an eye on moving forward. Some implications with regards to soybean management. One, look at those soil temperatures. That's one of those things a lot of us don't look at early in the season. When I look at up here, this last spring, it was moist and cool, and it was moist because it was cool. So we didn't get that early season warm up. We didn't cross that 50-degree threshold until about May 24th, which is pretty late in the season. After we cross 50 degrees, we warm up, we tend to mineralize more nutrients, the soil biology begins to kick in. Before that, we tend to see that response to that starter fertilizer. So one thing we've noticed over the years is these starter strategies, and this goes back about the last 8 years, do not appear to impact the plant's inherent fixation capabilities. And that's when we maximize that N application starter at about 25 units of N. We've noticed when we tend to get above that threshold, we then tend to cut back on fixation. So it's something to hone in on here. We've tended to increase biomass production between V4 through R8 with starter fertilizer strategies. We've seen a lot of yield increases, a few reductions over the last 6+ years. So we know there's a potential for yield gaps, especially with early planted soybeans and N fixation, but we also have to look at some of this late season weather pattern. You know, for us, once we get to that seed fill, that last week in July, first week in August, if we're dry, it's reduced. If we're moist, it's maximized. And we got to look at biomass. We've grown a lot of biomass on soybeans the last couple of years, which has promoted, in some instances, white mold. In some instances, it has not. But again, that's all on 30-inch rows. So if you're on 15s or even narrower drilled, it's something to keep an eye on. You can fertilize some of these plants a little bit too much. So my take-home point with soybeans would be, one, look at that P and K soil test level, especially with potassium. You want to look at that early in the season or in the fall prior. And our return on investment with all of our starter strategies over the last couple of years, we have seen anywhere from 4 to 5 bushel increases in soybean yields in our good years. But I will tell you right now, our return on investment has rarely been positive. All right. And we know how a lot of us are paid is not based on soybean biomass. It's based on bucks in the bank, right? And so that return on investment has been rarely positive. So again, something to keep an eye on moving forward with regards to fertilizing soybeans. I want to switch gears here a little bit, talk about a new sulfur publication that we just put out in conjunction with Purdue. Joint effort, covers corn, soy, alfalfa, and wheat. Goes over explanation of sulfur deficiencies. I know there were a few questions before I hopped on here today on that. Goes over diagnosing S deficiencies, goes over probably 5, 6, 7, 8 different sources and differences between some of these S sources that you might use to correct them. So we have that posted on our website. I know Purdue does also, so feel free to check that out. With regards to S application timing on corn, we always get this question. Corn tends to be a little bit more responsive. I know Laura brought this up a little bit. Our N responsive crops tend to be a little bit more responsive to sulfur, right? And that indirectly implies that N to S ratio. We too have not seen dramatic S responses on soybeans. We tend to see much more common responses to S application on corn and wheat and a few of the other crops we grow here in the state. Now, this last growing season, we want to look at, okay, we know we might need S on corn. When's the best time to apply it? So you can see looking at that yellow and blue bar on the far right-hand side, we looked at S applied at 2x2, so at planting time, and then also at side dress time, V3-4, and coulter it in midway between the rows. Didn't see any response across the board. Now, I'll explain that in a second. Another location, same thing. So does that mean we should not apply S on corn? No, it does not. What that implies is it was dry. We had a lot of dry weather from about mid to late May through June this last growing season. And so it doesn't mean we don't necessarily need to apply S. It's going to be weather dependent. And so our best piece of advice is, especially in something like corn, and also applies to wheat, when needed, apply that sulfate S as close as you can to planting time or in season. With something like wheat, that might also be in the fall. Okay, I'm not going to talk much about wheat here today, but we've done a lot of fall wheat nutrient management, have a lot of work out there on that. Deficiency in previous years or occurrence of symptoms might be that best indicator of need. For something like corn, you're probably looking at optimal rates in that 10 to 15 pound of S per acre range. Wheat, we tend to bump that up a little bit because it has to go through that fall period, go through winter, go through dormancy, green up again. We tend to need a little bit more in our experience, but it's going to depend on weather. It's going to depend on your placement a little bit, your source, and some of those timing considerations, especially for anybody who may have applied S last fall. I don't know if winter has actually begun yet for us here in the state, and it's already February 10th. We've gotten a lot of rain, another 1.5 inches over the last 24 hours. And so remember, S can move in that soil profile. So that would be something you want to keep an eye on moving forward also. I heard this question come up a little bit. We've done a lot of biological work over the last couple of years, and we have a North Central group looking at this question of, can biologicals substitute for fertilizer nutrients? So what we're looking at is more of these asymbiotic and fixing organisms, right? Those that can fix atmospheric N2, transform it to ammonia, attach it to a carbon skeleton, and then mobilize it in the plant. Where I think a lot of people get muddied here with regards to understanding these organisms is we have to remember that N fixation requires a heck of a lot of energy. When you look at that triple bond of nitrogen, all right, in that we fix from the atmosphere, that is probably in some opinion the strongest bond known to man. And it's the hardest bond to break. In order to break it, it requires a lot of energy. So to convert one mole or one molecule of N2 to ammonia requires about 16 ATP molecules. That's a lot of energy, especially when you consider down below there, you can see one peptide bond and protein synthesis only requires about 5 ATP. All right. And so the limiting factor to N fixation becomes energy. And there's no free ride here. You have to get that energy from somewhere. And so when you look at the application of a lot of these asymbiotic N fixing organisms, those products that are applied to the soil, oftentimes those organisms are going to have to get their energy from organic matter that is in the soil, or root exudates from those roots because they're a carbon source, or other residue decay compounds that are in that bulk soil. Those organisms that get applied to the plant must get their energy from within the plant in which they reside. So basically, they're going to take sugars and carbohydrates from that plant. So a lot of these asymbiotic N fixing bacteria that we're reading about, a lot of them are already in a lot of the soils that we work with. Now, their activity we know tends to go up when tillage goes down, and their activity tends to go up under moist, warm conditions. So that's that food and housing scenario that you hear a lot of people talk about. Microbes need someplace to live, and they also need something to eat. And when they have both, they're happy. And when they don't, or we inhibit that with tillage, then their activity tends to go down. The other thing, their activity tends to drop: dry soils, wet soils, cold soils, etc. And when there's a lot of inorganic N available, that can reduce N fixation. So we have a North Central group that gets together every fall. And this last year or two, we looked at a lot of different products that are out there. This is about a 12-state region, ranging from North and South Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, Iowa, Kentucky, and a few others that are in the mix. And we looked at a couple of different products you see listed on that screen there, pretty widespread, widely available. And we looked at a lot of these products in corn and wanted to look at N rates with and without that specific biological. So my colleague, Jim Camporato down at Purdue, he shared some of this data. They looked at that Envita product here the last couple of years. And you can see they got an N rate response in a lot of their trials, going from 0 to 205 units of N. But when they looked at application of those N rates with and without that specific biological, they saw absolutely no difference across the board. They also looked at a little bit of some of these biostimulants, some of these different bacteria combinations, fungal combinations, PGR mixes. Some cases they saw a little bump, in some cases they did not. We looked at all three of those products listed on the screen this last growing season on corn, going from about 60 up to 180 units of N. Again, we gauged an N response. If you look at this table, we have no application of biological at the top. Then we have the three products listed from left to right. And you can see we didn't see much of a yield response across the board. And it's not unexpected. You can see product rates listed over on the right-hand side. We also looked at NDVI, we looked at whole plant tissue N, we looked at ear leaf N, we looked at total biomass at maturity. Didn't see much of a difference across the board. So again, in many instances, sometimes we see some yield reductions with some of these products. And why? Again, some of these bacteria have to get their energy source from somewhere. We have to remember that moving forward. And so I put up a summary of results from 6 surrounding states, going from North Dakota, Minnesota, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Missouri. Whether we saw a response to a lot of these products, yes or no. And you can see summary over the last couple of years listed at the bottom. The number of no's outpaced the yeses substantially. So I do want to say we are coming out with a bulletin that summarizes a lot of our biological corn response over the last 2 to 3 years from about a 12-state region. I want to say in 2022, we had about 53 or 54 site years. Some were no-till, some were conventional, all sorts of different combinations in there. Excuse me. And we'll have that coming out here, hopefully in about the next week or two, maybe within the month, hopefully. And a lot of those data will also be posted on our website. And so a couple of wrap-up points to remember here moving forward. Don't forget the weather. Nutrients are impacted by the weather. They're impacted by water movement. They're impacted by lack of water. Right? So just because you may not see a response to something like sulfur in 1 year doesn't mean you should not apply. A lot of it has to do with the environment that that nutrient was placed into. You start looking at price point of commodities and price point of fertilizer. Remember that build and maintain approach for phosphorus potassium is structured for those current market conditions, right? Build it up to a level where you are sufficient, and then you may not have to apply. And it's okay not to apply if that soil test does not warrant an application. We have to remember that moving forward. End sources, use them appropriately. So if you're looking at maybe getting a better price point on a different end source, and you might apply it in a different manner, you might have to start looking at some of the inhibitor products out there, look at incorporation, look at all sorts of different infrastructure. You start looking at Y drops, drop nozzles, late season N, etc. So lots of different combinations. Sulfur, we've seen our best responses on something like corn and wheat. And again, on about that 15 units of S or so. Wheat's a little higher. Soybeans been a little bit more sporadic for us here in Michigan. And then on those biologicals, try them out on your own farm. Do some grower strips, replicate those strips. Big thing is make sure you look at it at multiple N rates. All right. So if you think something's going to save you 30, 40, 50 pounds of N, make sure you have an N rate that's 30, 40, or 50 pounds N less than what you usually go at because you have to know what that corn yield is without that specific product. And the other thing you have to be sure of is that not all the N rates when you use these products are above recommended N rates, because if they are, you're not going to see a yield decline when you drop that N rate because you're above recommendations to begin with. One slide I want to throw up there as I wrap up is I'm a part of this non-traditional materials for crop production committee, this NCERA 103 committee. We just moved our website over to a new website. You can see it listed there on the screen. So again, that's about another 12 state consortium. And this site has lots of different research results on it. Lots of stuff, as I like to say. It has some biologicals, different soil amendments, growth promoting products, etc. And these go back a number of years. So if you're sitting at home one evening bored and don't know what to do, take a look at this website, and you might be able to find some scientific data on some of these products that we tend to see marketed to all of you.